Welcome to this lecture on game taxonomy. In the previous section, we introduced the fundamental components that define every game, including the players, the strategies available to them, the payoffs they received, and the equilibrium concepts used to predict the behavior. These elements tell us what a game contains, but they don't tell us exactly how games differ from one another. In this lecture, we begin classifying games according to their structural characteristics, a process known as game taxonomy. Just as economists classify markets into perfect competition, monopoly, or oligopoly, game theorists classify strategic interactions according to several dimensions that determine how players reason and make decisions. Our focus in this lecture is the temporal structure of games. We will see that simply changing the organization of time can fundamentally alter the strategies players choose and methods we use to analyze the game. So, where are we standing right now? Before learning something new, it's always useful to connect it with something you already know. So before building the taxonomy of games, let's take a moment to look at the big picture. If you have completed your first course in microeconomics, then much of what you see on the left side of this table should already be familiar. You learned about consumers, firms, utility maximization, profit maximization, supply, demand, and market equilibrium. In other words, you already know how economists model decision making. Now, do you think that game theory threw all of that away and start from scratch? The answer is not at all. Game theory builds upon exactly the same foundations. We still study rational decision makers, optimization, and equilibrium. What changes is the environment in which decisions are made. Instead of asking, what is my best decision, game theory asks, what is my best decision given that other people are making decisions too? That single change transforms the entire analysis. Let's use this table to understand how the concepts you already know evolve into the language of game theory. Let's begin with the decision makers themselves. In microeconomics, we usually talk about economic agents, such as consumers and firms. In game theory, we simply call them players or agents. Don't let the word player mislead you. A player is not necessarily someone playing chess or poker. It can be a company competing in market, two countries negotiating a treaty, political candidates during an election, or even an artificial intelligent agent. The terminology changes, but the idea remains the same. Like someone must make decisions. Now, think about the environment in which these decisions are made. In microeconomics, decisions take place inside the market. And in game theory, we replace the market with something more general. A game, before we analyze behavior, we must define the rules of the interaction. Who are the players? What action can they choose? Who moves first? What informations do they have? How are the payoffs determined? All these elements together define what we call the game structure. Next, ask yourself another question. Why do players make decisions? In microeconomics, consumers maximize their utility and firms maximize their profit. That principle remains exactly the same in game theory. We simply use the more general concept called payoff. Whether the objective is profit, utility, reputation, political influence, or any other measure of success, every player seeks to maximize their own payoff. By the way, a quick remark before we continue. Don't confuse an outcome with a payoff. The outcomes is a final situation created by the player's actions. It tells us that what actually happens. And the payoffs, on the other hand, represents how each player evaluates the possible outcomes. Players choose their actions by anticipating the payoffs associated with the outcomes they expect to occur. So remember this simple rule. Outcomes describe what happens. Payoffs describe how valuable those outcomes are to each player. Now, let me ask you another question. Imagine two companies competing in the same market. Before deciding on a price, what does each company actually know? Does it know the competitor production cost? Does it know the price that the competitor will choose? Can it observe previous decisions? Does it remember everything that happened earlier? Suddenly, information becomes just important as payoff. Unlike introductory microeconomics, where information is often simplified or taken for granted, game theory studies information explicitly. We ask what players know, what they observe, what they remember, and how that knowledge influences their strategic decisions. In fact, this entire topic will be the focus of our next lecture. Now, suppose you are one of these players. What exactly do you choose? In microeconomics, a consumer chooses a consumption bundle, while a firm chooses an output level or a price. In game theory, your decision is called a strategy, and here strategy has a very precise meaning. It's not simply a single action. A strategy is a complete plan of actions that specifies what you will do every time you are called upon to make a decision during the game. This definition becomes especially important in dynamic games, where a player may face several decision points. Finally, every model aims to predict what will happen. In microeconomics, we usually search for a market equilibrium where supply equals demand. Game theory also seeks an equilibrium, but now the reasoning is strategic. We ask whether any player can improve their payoffs by changing only their own strategy while everyone else keeps their unchanged. If the answer is no, then we have reached what we call a Nash equilibrium. It's the most famous and widely used equilibrium concept in game, but it's not the only one. Different strategic environments may require another equilibrium concept which we will explore throughout the course. So when we look at this table, don't think of microeconomics and game theory as two completely different subjects. Think of game theory as the natural extension of microeconomics. We still study rational individuals, optimization, and equilibrium. The key difference is that decisions are no longer made in isolation. Every player must think about the likely decisions for everyone else before deciding what to do. This table is therefore much more than a comparison. It's the roadmap for our entire course. Each concept on the game theory side represents a major topic that we will study in detail. Today we begin with the game structure and more specifically with its first component, the temporal structure, where we ask our first fundamental question: how is time organized in strategic interaction? By the way, I have to make note. The concept of rationality in decision-making under uncertainty starts from 4 fundamental axioms developed by von Neumann Morgenstern and completeness, transitivity, continuity, and independence. These axioms define the conditions that preferences must satisfy in order to be represented by an expected utility function. The first axiom, completeness, it means that a rational decision maker must be able to compare between two alternatives. For any two lotteries, the player can either prefer one, the other, or be indifferent between them. The second axiom is transitivity. It ensures consistency in preferences. If a player prefers lottery A to lottery B and the lottery B to lottery C, then the player should always prefer lottery A to C. This prevents contradictory choices. The third axiom is continuity. It ensures that preferences behave smoothly, meaning that small changes in outcomes or probabilities do not create sudden changes in preferences. In mathematical terms, continuity implies that preferences sets are closed, which allows preferences to be represented by a continuous utility function. When we move from preferences to optimization, we usually combine this assumption with a compact feasible set, meaning that the choice set is closed and bounded. Compactness is more important because together with the continuous utility function, it guarantees that an optimal choice exists. This is a mathematical foundation that allows economists to transform preferences into utility maximization problem. The fourth and the last axiom is independence. It states that if a player prefers one lottery over another, this preference should remain unchanged when both lotteries are mixed with the same third lottery with probability. And this axiom is the key assumption that allows preferences to be represented by an expected utility function. And together, these four axioms provide the foundation of expected utility theory. We will use it frequently. They allow us to move from qualitative description of preferences to a mathematical representation using utility function, which can be maximized to determine optimal decision and their uncertainty. Now, let us zoom into our temporal structure of a game, which is composed of four closely related components. The first is representation, which describes how the game is modeled, either as a payoff matrix or a game tree. The second component is a temporal design, which determines whether players make their decisions simultaneously or sequentially. The third is a time framework, which specifies whether time progresses through discrete stages or evolves continuously. Finally, the horizon indicates whether the interaction has a known ending or continues indefinitely. Although these all components appear to describe different aspects of time, together they define the strategic environment in which players operate. Even if the players' strategies and payoffs remains unchanged, modifying only one of these temporal dimensions can completely transform the strategic reasoning required to solve the game. Consequently, understanding temporal structure is essential before studying more advanced concepts such as informations, beliefs, or equilibrium refinements. We begin with the representation of a game, which refers to the way the strategic interaction is described mathematically. The most familiar representation is a strategic form, also called the normal form. In the normal form representation, we condense the game into a payoff matrix. Instead of playing move by move, players simultaneously choose a complete strategy, their entire plan of play. The matrix then matches these strategies to show the final payoffs. Because the matrix only records these and the results, it flattens the timeline, hiding the step-by-step sequence of decisions that actually took place. As a result, this representation is particularly appropriated for simultaneous games, where players choose their actions without observing one another, the main reason also called the one-shot games. You may hear in some video courses or even in the classroom that static games and normal form games are used as if they mean the same thing. However, they describe two different aspects of a game. A static game refers to the timing structure of decisions. Players choose their actions simultaneously without observing the choices made by others. A normal form game, on the other hand, refers to the mathematical representation of the game, specifying the players, their possible strategies, and even their associated payoffs. The reason for this common confusion is that static games are usually represented using the normal form, and the same type of distinction applies to dynamic games and extensive form games. So the second representation is extensive form, commonly illustrated by a game tree. Here, each node represents a decision point. Each branch corresponds to a possible action, and the tree explicitly displays the order in which decisions are made. It also shows which player moves at each stage and what choices are available at every decision point. So for this reason, extensive form representation is especially useful for analyzing dynamic and sequential interactions, where the timing of decision plays a central role. As we continue this course, we will frequently move between these two representations because each provides different insights into the same strategic situation. So once we understand how a game is set up, the next critical element to consider is timing, specifically when the players actually make their moves. These structural differences splits strategic thinking into two entirely distinct worlds. In a simultaneous game, players have to commit to their actions in total isolation without knowing what their opponents have chosen. It doesn't mean they're physically moving at the exact same millisecond, but it just means they face a massive blind spot, where success relies entirely on your ability to predict rival behavior. Think of sealed by adoption or competitors setting market prices at the exact same time. On the flip side, we have sequential games where players take turns and information flows chronologically. Here, later movers have the distinct advantage or disadvantage of reacting to a story. This dynamic introduce powerful opportunities for commitment, signaling, and forward calculation, where a bold first mover can aggressively dictate the direction he wants of the game and force everyone else to adapt to the reality they've already created. Here, but imagine now you're sitting across from someone playing chess. You aren't guessing in the dark, but you are staring at the board and watching exactly where they just placed their knight and calculating the next move based on the concrete reality. Or the picture of a parent trying to get their kid to do chores. The parent moves first by putting a reward to him on a table, and the kid observes the offer, weighs the effort, and decides whether to act or not. It's a clear sequence of action and reaction. Even something as simple as hanging over a used bicycle at a garage sale is a live, tactical back and forth. They name a price, You process the information and you make a counteroffer. Every single step you take is a direct calculated response to the move that came right before yours. So next time you find yourself in a strategic spot, ask yourself, are you playing blind in the dark? Or are you waiting, watching, and reacting to the move that came before you? The third component of temporal structure concerns the way time itself is modeled. In a discrete time framework, time is divided into separate stages and rounds. Players make decisions only at their specific moments. In other words, time moves step by step, and players take actions only when they reach their turn. A simple example in a rental apartment application, imagine that a tenant is looking for an apartment. First, the tenant searches for available apartments and decides whether to submit an application. Then the landlord observes the application and decides whether to accept or reject it. Depending on the decision, the tenant may take another action, such as accepting the offer or continuing the search. The important idea is that the interaction unfolds through a sequence of clearly separated stages. One decision comes after another. Because of this sequential structure, discrete time situations are naturally represented using tools such as extensive form games or dynamic programming, where the evolution of the game is described as a path through different stages or states. Now, let us move to the continuous time framework. Here, time does not move in separate steps. Instead, it evolves smoothly. Players can adjust their decision at any moment as the environment changes. A good way to visualize this is through the trajectory of an airplane during a landing approach. The airplane doesn't move from one fixed position to another in separate stages. Its position, attitude, speed, and direction are continuously changing over time. To maintain the desired trajectory, the pilot or control system continuously adjusts the aircraft controls in response to the current situation. And this type of problem is closely related to optimal control theory, where a single decision maker chooses to control action over time to achieve a specific objective. For example, in autopilot system may continuously adjust the airplane's movement to ensure a safe landing. In a strategic environment with several interacting decision makers, this idea is extended to differential games. Instead of one control and one objective, each player has their own control and their own objective. The evolution of the system depends on combined actions of all players, and each player continuously adapts their decisions in response to the others. Differential games are therefore useful for studying situations where strategic interactions evolve continuously over time, such as financial markets, arms races, dynamic competition between firms, or ongoing negotiations. So the main difference is the way time shapes the interaction. Discrete time models describes the games as a sequence of separate decisions, while continuous time models describe games as an ongoing process where players continuously adapt to a changing environment. The final dimension of temporal structure concerns the duration of the interaction. Does the game have a known ending point, or does it continue over a long period of time? In Finite-Horizon game, the interaction has a predetermined and commonly known final period, and this ending point may be announced by the instructor or the designer of the game when the rules are introduced before the interaction begins. Since all players know exactly when the game will terminate, they can anticipate the final stage and reason backward for it. And this reasoning process is known as backward induction. It often predicts that cooperation becomes more difficult and as the final period approaches because future opportunities for rewards, retaliation, or relationship building disappear. Once players reach the last stage, there is no future interaction left to influence their current decisions. So, for example, laboratory experiments in short-term renegotiations and temporary contracts are typically examples of finite horizon interactions. By contrast, an infinite horizon game has no predetermined ending point, so players either don't know when the interaction will stop or they analyze the situation as if the relationship could continue over a long lifetime. In such environments, the role of patience becomes crucial, and a patient player places significant value on future outcomes, and is therefore more willing to sacrifice short-term gains in order to preserve future benefits. Because today's behavior influences future relationships, cooperation can be sustained through the expectation of future rewards or the possibility of future punishment. This idea is captured by the concept of the shadow of the future. Players may cooperate today because they understand that their current actions will affect the future interactions. So this principle forms the basis of Folk theorem, which explains why cooperation can emerge in repeated settings, such as long-term business relationships, international agreements, and ongoing market competition, even when short-term incentives encourage players to act selfishly. So the essential idea here is that patient players who care about future consequences are more likely to maintain cooperative behavior because the future creates for them an incentives for cooperation today. In this lecture, we established the first major dimension of game taxonomy by studying the temporal structure of games. We learned that every strategic interaction can be characterized according to the four complementary questions: how the game is represented when players make their decision, how time evolves, and how long the interaction lasts. Together, these characteristics define the strategic environment in which players operate and determine the analytical tools required to solve the game. However, understanding when players make decisions is only one part of strategic reasoning. An equally important question remains unanswered now. What information does each player possess when making those decisions? Two games may have exactly the same players, the same actions, and even the same sequence of moves, yet produce entirely different strategic behavior simply because the players observe different information. In the next lecture, we will therefore move from the temporal structure dimension to the information structure of the games, where we will introduce the concept of information distribution and examine how players' knowledge and observation shape strategic decision making under certainty and uncertainty. See you next!